This is Wayman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.
Welcome back to another edition of Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. And for those listening on our affiliates or the YouTube channel, WBV Inside the News, we welcome you again. Okay, Frank, the president delivered the UN speech. Go.
Probably it was the most substantive and direct speech at the United Nations, certainly in a generation, if not in all time. The president addressed not only specific issues, but also prevailing trends in international affairs that, as the president outlined, failed to achieve peace, prosperity, or freedom. In doing so, President Trump almost completely, entirely repudiated all of President Obama's foreign policy, as well as the growing trend that places international bureaucracies over national governments. If you monitored the event, it was interesting to look at the reaction in the audience. Certainly when the president spoke that the U.S. respects not only the interest of its own citizens, but the sovereignty of every nation, that was a clear kick in the tail to the trend that's been taken not only at the UN, but in international affairs as well. I imagine in Brussels there are a bunch of European Union bureaucrats who were kind of shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they monitored this speech. The president made clear that he doesn't attempt to seek to impose American values on the rest of the world, but expects other nations to do what's best for their own citizens. And he clearly made it known that he believes that most other countries, or many other countries, specifically nations like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, weren't acting in the best interest of their own citizens. I think that he outlined the contributions that the United States has made, noting that after World War II, the United States didn't seek power or gain, but instead used its national treasure to rebuild former enemies and indeed rebuild former current friends as well. I think he kind of preempted the type of criticism we generally hear of the United States by members of the United Nations.
You bring up an interesting point there, Frank, and then and Ben, we're going to be going to you about the sovereignty of nations, that each nation in itself is sovereign in its own right. And it does put the European Union on notice, saying, wait a minute, you don't control France, you don't control Great Britain, each nation is sovereign. And coming together at the UN, you come together as each individual country, and then together we try and solve some world peace issues. Ben?
Well, let me start by saying that Frank and I don't always agree, but in this case, we strongly agree. The speech earlier today by the president was a tour de force. It was one of those rare speeches. I think once in every generation, a leader comes along and cuts through the fog and haze of diplomatic speak to describe the world as it really is. And of course, I'm thinking about Winston Churchill on March 5th, 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, when he gave the famous Iron Curtain speech. It was the first recognition that the dictator Joseph Stalin was now in control of Eastern Europe, and the world was going to be very different than what people thought coming out of World War II. I go back to the speech in 1983 in Orlando, Florida, by President Ronald Reagan, where he called the Soviet Union an evil empire and laid out the reality of the world as we faced it. And I heard that exact type of speech today by Donald Trump. He took on everyone out there in a very realistic fashion. He called out the UN for what it does wrong, for what is embarrassing. He called out the UN for having countries like Zimbabwe, of course, led by the evil, bloodthirsty dictator Robert Mugabe, for being on the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations and how disgraceful that is to the UN. He applauded what the UN could be as it was envisioned originally by Harry Truman in the early 50s, of the UN actually leading the charge for peace and prosperity around the world. So Donald Trump, who could have walked in there and basically said, look, we're going to take our money and our cards and we're going to go home and we're going to abandon the UN. He did not do that. He reaffirmed the original mission of the United Nations to be a source of peace and greatness and to bring freedom around the world. And he decried how far away from that the UN is on occasion these days. He attacked Venezuela, a very memorable line, I thought one of his best of his speech. He said that Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro is not suffering from the failed implementation of socialism, but from the faithful implementation of socialism. And he talked very realistically how socialism has failed wherever it's been implemented. It has brought nothing but poverty and misery to every country that has tried it. He called out Iran and the leadership of Iran, not the people of Iran. He praised the people of Iran. He called out the leadership of Iran, their support of terrorism, their pursuit of nuclear weapons. And he called the Iranian deal that we signed under Barack Obama and negotiated under Barack Obama is the worst deal ever. And he set the stage, I believe, to announce in the not too distant future that we will ultimately pull out of that deal and take a different path where we once again confront Iran and their desires. And he made it very clear, I thought it was a great moment, that we will utterly destroy North Korea if we have to. And I think that message should be delivered by the president loud and clear to the entire world, just the way he did it, so that people have no misunderstanding as to what is at stake as we sit and watch North Korea continue to develop their ballistic missile and nuclear technology. And I applaud him. I thought his speech was fantastic from A to Z. I thought it was Donald Trump at his best, and it was a very inspiring for me to hear it.
Okay, Frank, a couple observations, and then you might want to take off on what Ben just said. An observation that Donald Trump is more astute about world affairs and foreign relations than what most people thought, number one. Two, the Democrats, deep in their gut, knows they know he's right, but they disagree with it because it's not their agenda of wanting other people's money and the redistribution of wealth. There's my two observations, Frank. Go.
You know, a lot of electronics and computers have a reset button where you can go back to the factory settings on your piece of equipment. I thought what President Trump did today was pressing the reset button at the United Nations. Somewhere along the line, the United Nations, which, by the way, has a wonderful charter. I've read it a couple of times. It actually has a lot of great stuff in it. Somewhere along the line, the United Nations totally forgot its own charter and its own reason to exist. What President Trump did today was press the reset button on the United Nations, reminding the organization what it was founded for in the first place and what it's supposed to be doing. When he's called out aggressive actions, for example, North Korea or China in the South China Sea or even Ukraine, the Russian incursion into the Ukraine, he's reminding the United Nations and all of the world's population that this is wrong, and that the United Nations was formed to counter aggression just like that. The president also reminded everyone that it's the people of nations, not the bureaucrats of nations, that are supposed to be the focus of what the United Nations is seeking to accomplish. Again, somewhere along the line, the United Nations changed its focus from individuals to bureaucracies, whether it be the European Union or trade organizations or so forth. And as the president made an analogy of the American middle class being the forgotten people, so too individuals suffering under failed, inappropriate, or despotic governments around the world have been forgotten by the United Nations. This was a great pushing of a reset button that was long, long overdue. A gutsy move on the part of the president.
Ben, your thoughts on the reset button?
I couldn't agree more. And I think what the president went back to and reiterated more than once in his speech was that the strength of the United Nations depends on the underlying strength of each sovereign nation that comprises the UN. And that is the original conception of the United Nations. And that is what we have, as Frank correctly laid out, moved away from over the decades. The United Nations has become a career destination for bureaucrats and apparatchiks the world over who go into these burgeoning bureaucracies that never stop growing. It is no different than the way the EU works these days. And of course, what they all work for is their own self-interest and their own growing power base and bureaucratic power base. And that he decried that, he attacked that, he deplored it, and he said the UN must get back to working on behalf of the people of the nation who seek a better life, who seek freedom, who seek peace and prosperity. And that is exactly the right message to deliver. I was heartened by the fact that most of what the president said in that speech was warmly received inside the UN. And I really, that surprised me. I didn't know what to expect, but I thought he might even get some boos on occasion. He did not get that at all. He was highly respected in that speech, and there were a lot of applause. So I found that quite reassuring. Now, it's one thing to deliver the speech. It's quite another to reform an institution like the UN that is so bureaucratic and where so few people are held to account. And I'm not optimistic that there will be a whole lot of change, but at least when the leadership sets the tone, there is hope for change.
Frank, Donald Trump is comfortable in his own skin. He's got confidence in himself, and he doesn't need a whole lot of pats on the back to say, hey, you're doing a good job. Macron of France is now one of his allies who says, I'm willing to align with you. And I believe people like strong people who are fighting for what is right. And do you get that sense as well, Frank?
Oh, I certainly did, and I think the president's message is very clear. He's in favor of peace, freedom, justice, family, humanity, and God. And I just imagine what some college campuses must be like with those messages. Apparently, the referral to God, I think, must have kicked a lot of academics in the rear. You're not supposed to talk about that in the public square anymore. One of the things the president did that is consistent with the way he governs in the United States is going over the heads of the interest and the powers and going directly to the people. Just there's this great, hue and cry here in America about the president going over the head of the media and talking directly to the American people through tweets. I thought also in this speech, by referencing individuals within nations, saying that the United States is with the people of oppressed nations, I thought he also went over the heads of the international bureaucrats and, indeed, over the heads of despots and dictators across the planet, whether we're talking about Kim Il-jung, whether we're talking about Maduro from Venezuela, or, indeed, Vladimir Putin of Russia. When he talked about individuals and how they're not being served, I thought he did the same thing internationally that he has done domestically, and I think it's extremely effective. What I'd be curious to see in the days and weeks after this is the reaction of individuals within countries that can still access outside information, and we know that even in places like Iran, perhaps not North Korea, but certainly in Iran, individuals can have access to this information, and how they react to it. Remember, in Iran, the Obama administration, the only Arab Spring movement the Obama administration did not support was the Green Revolution in Iran, which is the only one we actually should have supported. Now this president has given a different message. He repudiated Obama's foreign policy, and he's returned America to a policy that really respects individual freedom. It's going to be interesting how it's received around the world.
Okay, Ben, what does this do with the Obama direction, the Soros direction, that they thought they had a handle on this thing in the 8 years that Obama had in office? What does that do to that, Ben?
Well, you see the reaction that we've been witnessing since the day Donald Trump won the election, which is the revolution, the quiet insurrection of the deep state, and all of the people embedded in government in Washington and various agencies, surprisingly to me, including a lot of intelligence operatives, but in predictable agencies like the State Department, which has for decades had a left-wing one global worldview type of approach to its business. But you've seen that in the pushback against Donald Trump. So this has been going on, this recognition that Donald Trump was going to repudiate this entire approach. Of course, that was the central theme of his campaign. The U.S. as a sovereign nation, America first. He made it very clear, and he's been consistent on this, that he is going to put the interests of our country above other interests, that he was the president of the United States, not the president of the United Nations. And it was very uncertain sometimes when you watch Barack Obama whether he understood he was the president of the United States or not, because in so many instances he put the interests of a globalist view above the interests of our country. So Donald Trump, the electorate elected him to repudiate that approach. You've seen the insurrection underway to try to fight back, aided and abetted by the left-stream media out there, who largely share that approach. But the power of a speech like the one today, which cuts through all of that fog and haze and lays out the reality and what is at stake and how it is the individual that really matters, not these international state organs that get created like the EU, like the United Nations, that become a entity in and of themselves above the people and over the people. That is the true danger. And I just thought that the president today hit the nail on the head in every aspect. And I look forward to the follow-up. He still has a lot of work to do to clear house. It is a daunting task to get the deep staters out of powers of influence, centers of influence within our government, in order to try to implement his vision. And I hope he has 2 terms to do it, because he'll need it.
All right. So much more to talk about, and this brings to a close segment number 1. And USAGovPolicy.com is where you can find Frank Vernuccio, the editor-in-chief of the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, the writer and the voice of the syndicated radio feature Minute Report for America. BenBrunson.com and Amazon.com is where you can find Ben Brunson. He's the author of The Falstaff Enigma and Esther Sling. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wayman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.